Okay, well, I think the academic link between the two subjects is found in the subject of comparative cosmology. Velikovsky used references from various cultures, ancient texts, and so forth, the same kinds of references I would use for my Dogen studies to justify his theories. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, Salem and Portland, Oregon, and in the 1970s, that was the hotbed of support for Velikovsky's theories. And so you could, at that time, you could hardly walk down a city street without seeing a copy of a magazine available for free discussing Velikovsky's theories. And then over the years, I had paid attention to the controversy and became more and more interested when I realized that after a very long period of time, it hadn't become resolved. And so I started asking myself if it might not be possible to find a single fact that would demonstrate in some unequivocal way that Velikovsky either could not be right or that he must be right.
We just wanted to mention, by the way, Laird, if there is such a thing as a Red Eyes guest headquarters, it's got to be Portland. There are so many Oregonians on this program. It's crazy.
Yes, well, Oregonians have always thought outside the box.
Well, there you go. It's got to be that.
I had an education in Salem, Oregon that was a very unusual approach to education that actively encouraged my classmates and I to think outside the box.
Well, there you go. I didn't mean to cut you off there, so please go ahead. And I want to get into it a little bit later here as well. In terms of Velikovsky's work himself, where because he certainly have spearheaded this, and so many other people have picked up on his work, either, maybe gotten a slightly different theory, elaborated on it, or further just trying to find evidence for his theories. But how much do you know about his background, where he got some of the data and information from, Laird?
Okay, let's start and give you a little bit of background on who Velikovsky was and how he came to his theory and some of the basic tenets of his theory. Okay, Velikovsky was trained as a doctor and then as a psychiatrist, and started out in Berlin. He was a Jew, and he published an academic journal in Berlin that was very well received and that was edited partially by Albert Einstein. And then he and Einstein were both known for their involvement in establishing the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And so also Velikovsky had been trained by one of the most famous students of Sigmund Freud, a gentleman by the name of Wilhelm Steckler. And so Velikovsky was a person who had a presence on the international scene before he ever wrote a book. But shortly before 1950, he brought his family to New York City, intending to research a historical book that he eventually published called Oedipus and Akhenaten. He had noticed parallels between stories about the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten and stories about Oedipus, and wanted to write a psychological, historical book on that subject. And so he was spending a lot of time in the Columbia University Library researching for that. And during the process of that research, he stumbled across some references in Egypt to a time of great upheaval. And the sorts of events they were describing included things like rivers running red and major earthquakes and major volcanic eruptions and unusual things happening with the animal world and so forth. And he made a connection to the descriptions in the book of Exodus of events that happened at the time Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. And so he wondered whether there might be a historical basis for those biblical accounts, and he realized, based on the scope of the upheaval, that this would not have been a localized event in Egypt. It would have been an event that would have been registered in other parts of the world. And so he started looking for texts from other cultures that might have a similar report from a similar time period.
See, that's interesting, because it seems then that we've gone through a period where biblical history was for a while there kind of taken as this is what happened in history. This is just the way it is. Then we have the emergence of the scientific field, and these theories and ideas slowly are kind of pushed to the side, and then they begin to re-emerge again with both with Velikovsky, of course, but also, before that, his friend then Sigmund Freud also did his own studies on comparative mythology, if you will, between like a character like Moses and Akhenaten as well. So that whole gang, if you will, then from that time, were looking into the Bible as being something real, story-wise, that actually took place and actually happened around Egypt and Middle East at the time.
Right, or at least that some of the events reported in the Bible had basis in fact.
That's right.
Now, unfortunately, from the time of Darwin's theory on, Darwin's theory requires the principle of uniformity, which is basically a sense that the universe has remained in a fairly constant state for a very, very long period of time, long enough for the effects of evolution to work their way. And so fire and brimstone sort of religion is counter to that idea and undercuts Darwinism. And so that's part of the reason the scientific world was upset with Velikovsky, because it looked to them as if he was trying to resurrect this fire and brimstone religion, and they saw that as a threat.
Do you think that that's what he tried to do?
No, I don't think he was trying to do that. I think he had made some connections that he felt in his mind were legitimate, and he was pursuing them, and that he didn't have an ultimate end in terms of what this is going to do to the scientific world. He was trying to. He's a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and had approached it from the standpoint that there seemed to be a kind of global amnesia about the fact that these events had occurred.
Oh yeah,
and that was the original standpoint that he was addressing it from.
As soon as I heard about Velikovsky's theory, some of his work, I've been fascinated by it. There's something that just, draw you in, of course, because it's just descriptive of such incredibly dramatic events. The whole cosmology is involved, and there are so many different aspects to his work. But what fascinated you the most with his theories when you began reading about it?
Well, actually, the thing that kept sticking in my mind was I didn't understand how a theory that so many people were saying must be nonsense could persist as long as his theory did. His book was published in 1950, and at the time it published, many of the things he said went dramatically against conventional scientific wisdom about how the world works. For example, at the time of 1950, there were people making speeches suggesting that we might be able to colonize Venus. It was enough like the Earth. But Velikovsky's viewpoint was, based on ancient myths, was that Venus had to be a fairly recent addition to the solar system, not more than a few thousand years old. And logic told him that if Venus is a recent planet, that it's got to still be very hot. Too hot for anybody to ever think about colonizing.
Yep.
So he made these sorts of just common sense conclusions based on what these ancient texts were saying had happened, and presented them in his book. And over time, certain pieces kept showing themselves to be true, things that scientists had flatly said could not possibly be true. For example, Velikovsky had concluded that electromagnetism must be a major force at work in the solar system between the interactions of planets. And that based on that, he expected that Jupiter would be emitting radio signals. And he tried to convince his friend Einstein to explore that, and Einstein deferred. He basically declined to get involved in the discussion. Well, 2 years later, a couple of astronomers who were exploring an entirely different subject happened to discover radio signals emitting from Jupiter. And so Einstein became one of the early scientists who found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to reverse himself after having made a categorical statement that disallowed what Velikovsky was saying. And when you follow the history of the controversy over what is now more than 60 years, that's the story over and over again, is that someone makes a pronouncement that is flatly against Velikovsky, and then a fact turns up that makes that person back away from their original pronouncement.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? They're so, I mean, the longer this argument it hangs around, the more persistent it is almost, and the more we discover, consequently, scientifically, it seems to back up the main theory. And there's new attacks, obviously, on his work. We'll talk a little bit about some of this later. But if his work primarily then was based on myth to come to some of these conclusions, do you know if at the time he was writing it back in 1950, and we're primarily here talking about Worlds in Collision, his first book, I believe.
That's right.
And that one there, was there any scientific evidence at the time available, as you know, that he based his theories on?
He used the scientific information that was available to him, but it was pretty primitive compared to what we have now, because this was a decade before or more before we started sending space probes out. So everything we had at that time was based on Earth-based observations or speculation. So there wasn't a lot of science from an astronomic standpoint to be able to base this on. Let me restate for anyone who is not familiar with it what the basic tenets of Velikovsky's theory are.
Yes.
And then we'll go in a little more to exploring it. Okay. Listeners may recall ancient Greek myths that talk about a goddess being born from the head of Zeus, where Zeus is thought to correspond to Jupiter, and the goddess who is born, from some perspectives, is thought to be Venus. And so Velikovsky's conclusion, based on reports from other cultures, was that it looked as if Venus had been somehow ejected from Jupiter, which goes against most prevailing theories of how celestial dynamics work. Jupiter is very massive, and the kind of event that it would take to eject a planet the size of Venus from Jupiter is pretty enormous. Now, after that, Velikovsky concluded that Venus had made a path through the universe that intersected some of the other planets. He said that Venus had made a close encounter with the Earth around 1500 BC that was responsible for the gigantic eruption of Thera in the Middle East, and was responsible for most of the effects reported at the time of the Exodus. He said that Venus made a direct impact on Mars and knocked it out of its orbit and caused it to start making recurring passes near the Earth that every 17 years or so would create havoc. And so you had prophecies by biblical prophets that met with these recurring visits, supposedly from Mars. He then says that after the encounter with the Earth, that Venus settled down into its orbit. Originally, Venus is described in ancient texts before 1500 using imagery and words that are typically reserved for comets, not for planets. And Venus was typically classified by ancient cultures before 1500 BC alongside the moon and the sun because it was so very bright. It was so bright that it could be seen moving across the sky during the course of a day. It was so very bright that it was compared in brightness to the sun, which is not true about Venus today. After Venus settled back down into its orbit, then there were certain attributes that Velikovsky concluded must be true about it. For example, that if it had done all that roaming through the universe, that it must have an unusual rotation or revolution around the sun. It wouldn't be the same as the other planets. And that because it was a young planet, it should have a pristine surface, and it should have a very, very hot surface. So these conclusions, which Velikovsky referred to as prognostications, were just, from my standpoint, just common sense results of what his theory said had happened. They weren't the product of any remarkable insight that came from scientific knowledge. It just came as a direct result of what he said had happened based on the theory.
Mm-hmm. One point I want to talk a little bit more about Venus in detail. This concept coming to us from the ancient world that the goddess was born from the head of Zeus. Do you think that this was an event then that actually could be seen from the Earth at the time? And would that also possibly mean that the configuration of our solar system at the time was different? What do you think about that?
Well, based on Velikovsky's theory, if you entertain the idea that Velikovsky is right, then the configuration of the universe has changed because Mars has been knocked out of its original orbit by Venus, and Venus was never really an original part of the configuration to begin with, so that's changed. And it's hard to predict what other effects might have happened, but you would have at least that.
Uh, Anything else you can say about the configuration at the time of the solar system? I don't know personally how detailed Velikovsky was about that, but in this theory layer, there's a lot of different theories. Another one I've actually heard is that Venus actually might have been the core from Mars itself. Hence, there we have the big scar as being Valles Marineris. I don't know if that's kind of pertinent to our discussion today, but is this things we can be certain about? I mean, we even have a potential planetary body that have totally vanished in the solar system, now just being the asteroid belt. So there's a number of different effects that might have happened because we got a rogue planet or a rogue element either being expelled from Jupiter or possibly another planet. What do you think?
Right. Well, because there are so many striking similarities between Venus and the Earth, they're both approximately the same size. There are a lot of attributes about Venus that look like early Earth, and the two planets are considered to be very, very similar. My conclusion would be that whatever process formed Venus also formed the Earth. Oh. So that would say to me that Venus probably is not the core of Mars. It's probably a properly formed planet just as the Earth is.
So what about this theory then, if we're going to Jupiter a little bit, that we have a core, or that Venus was expelled from Jupiter? If so, how would that work, do you think?
Okay, the myth says that just before Venus was born from Jupiter, that there was a goddess named Metis, M-E-T-I-S, and that Metis was pregnant, and that the prophecy was that Metis was going to give birth to a child who was even more powerful than Jupiter or Zeus. And so, according to the myth, Zeus swallowed Metis, and then shortly after Zeus swallowed Metis, Venus was born. Now, if you take that as a parable for actual astronomical events, that suggests that some kind of a body impacted Jupiter and that caused Venus to be ejected. Now, we don't have any quantitative information about what that impact would have been like, or what angle it might have hit Jupiter at, or how it produced the material that would have become Venus. But there's a recent theory, a computer model developed by a Chinese astronomer in 2010, that it was trying to explain why Jupiter has a much smaller and hotter core than theory predicts it should have. And according to his models, if a planet 10 times the size of the Earth were to have hit Jupiter and then sunk to its core, it would have vaporized the core of Jupiter. And from my standpoint, that event has the quality of energy that Carl Sagan required to eject a body the size of Venus from Jupiter.
So has there actually been calculations on that, on how much would be needed, so to speak, of a body for this to actually work?
I don't think that the astronomer who developed the computer model has any interest in trying to demonstrate whether or not Venus could have been ejected by the event. But Carl Sagan had said that as an argument against Velikovsky, that had any such event happened, it would have vaporized large portions of Jupiter, and those portions would have to remain intensely hot today. And the truth is that it looks like Jupiter's core has been vaporized, and it is twice as hot as it ought to be according to theory.
Wow, that's really, really interesting. But what do you make of timelines on this? If we look back in the mythological record, it seems to be stretching, at least, again, within the parameter of these 10,500 BC or approximately 12,000 years ago. Is that too little in your estimation? Or are we talking about much, much further back in history? What do you think?
It's hard to judge. I do know that before 1500 BC there are references to Venus, but Venus is not talked about as a planet. It's talked about as if it were a comet. So the boundary seems to be around 1500 BC. After 1500 BC, you start having references to Venus that sound more like a planet, but they're still very hard to pin down. For example, many different cultures around 1500 BC started having an apparent obsession with the movements of Venus. For example, in China, the oracle bone writing, which is the earliest surviving form of writing in China, is thought to have been invented particularly to track the movements of Venus. And that dates from the Shang dynasty, which is commensurate with that era of about 1500 BC.
1500. So that at least gives us an estimation approximately when the planet or the comet then at that point actually begins to settle down and end up in a more stable planetary orbit of sorts. But it doesn't tell us how long it might have been roaming around us as the comet, if you will.
No, it doesn't, and no one has any firm way of knowing how old these myths, how far back they date. But we can be sure that there was heightened concern about Venus around 1500 BC that extends at least through 750 BC. And you have Ptolemy in the first centuries AD recording rising and setting values, counting the number of days between the apparent rising and setting of Venus, and drawing pictures of the phases of Venus, like the phases of the moon that he could see. And later, around 1580, you have Copernicus doing the same thing. He draws pictures of the phases of the planet and records timings of its risings and settings. Now, the problem is that neither one of those recorded sets agrees with the other. Ptolemy's drawings don't agree with Copernicus's, and neither one of those agree with our sightings of Venus today. And the timings of their rising and settings don't agree with each other and don't agree with our timings. So what that says to me is that even as late as 1500 BC or 1500 AD, at the time of Copernicus, that Venus's orbit was still changing.
Still changing. Is there any evidence that it's still in some kind of different pattern today, or is it very stable as we see it today?
There was an announcement in the last couple of weeks that it looks as if Venus's rotation has slowed by 6 minutes in the last 6 years.
Really? That's actually quite a bit, though.
Yes, that's a huge amount. And it couldn't happen without some force acting on Venus that they haven't accounted for.
So for all we know, this could eventually actually come to a complete stop, if you will, and it become a, dead planet, actually. Or,
theoretically, it could reverse itself and start spinning the same way as most of the other planets.
Ah, I see. Of course. That's why it's potentially settling down, because it's still trying to conform, if you will, then to the influences of the sun primarily, right?
Yes. Now, there's also an apparent rotational resonance between Venus and the Earth that's similar to the moon and the Earth. As the moon revolves around the Earth, it always shows the same side to the Earth.
Right.
Well, every time Venus comes to what's called the point of inferior conjunction with the Earth, the closest point where they come to each other in their orbits, Venus always shows the same side to the Earth. Now, that might be coincidental, but if it's not coincidental, it almost has to be the consequence of either a close encounter with the Earth or forces that are acting on Venus that we haven't accounted for.
There is another interesting aspect to this, which has to do with Venus and when mankind began tracking Venus in the sky, because that potentially might be where we first started using the symbol of the pentagram. Because what is it? Is it every 7th year or something like that it actually performs a pentagonal shape around the Earth? Isn't that right, Laird?
That's right. So yeah, that's very possible, and I haven't explored that aspect of the pentagram symbolism, but I can believe that could quite possibly be true.
Since this seems to be one of the earlier symbols in mankind's ancient history in one sense, so that's very fascinating. What is there anything else anomalous we can talk about when it comes to Venus, Laird?
Oh, absolutely. If you talk about historical views of Venus, one of the complaints against Velikovsky was it was suggested that he had misinterpreted his sources about astronomical sightings of Venus that had happened in the past. And it was complained that he couldn't absolutely confirm that when two cultures made a report that they were reporting the same event. So the approach I took with my book was to not rely on Velikovsky or his sources, to try to rely on sources that had not been available to Velikovsky and see whether what those sources say in any way agree with what Velikovsky says. And what I discovered was that there are astronomic tables, or there are sightings of Venus that happened in China and in Korea. There are actually long texts that record astronomical events that are synchronized with each other. And on the same date at the same time, there are two sightings of a supernova explosion that is compared to Venus with its outstanding rays, which is a description that is typically given for a comet, not for a planet.
Mm-hmm.
The report said that the supernova was so bright that it could be seen during the daytime, like Venus with its outstanding rays. And both reporters, one in Korea and one in China, on the same date, make the same report.
Huh. Interesting. How? What peoples are this from? Do we have a name on them? These are the Asian tribes at the time, I guess, that are writing about what they're seeing in the sky, correct?
Yes, the sources I had didn't mention the name of what name the tribes were called by back then. They assigned them to Korea and to China.
Okay, I see. What about the tail? There's another discovery, and of course you write about these in the Velikovsky Heresies, your latest book, about the subject on all these latest kind of discoveries that support the work, as you say. But there's another one, a discovery of a comet-like tail on Venus. Tell us about that.
Well, recent probes to Venus discovered that they were trying to measure ions in the planet's atmosphere, and every time the probe would circle the planet, it would take a measurement. And some researcher noticed that they were losing ions, that the count wasn't the same every time they came back around. And they discovered that the closer Venus got to the sun, the more they were losing these ions. And so they started trying to trace where they went to, and at first discovered that they had moved from one side of Venus to the other side of the planet. But then they noticed that not only had they moved to the other side of the planet, they were actually leaving the planet, and that in fact Venus has what's called an ion tail that points away from the sun like a comet's tail and extends out into space. And at the point of this inferior conjunction that I was talking about between Venus and the Earth, actually extends as far as and points directly to the Earth. So that may or may not be the planetary equivalent of a comet's tail. Now, the argument made against that is, well, nobody has ever seen a planet with a comet's tail. Well, one of my friends who explores exoplanets, planets that exist in other solar systems, recently reported the sighting of a planet in another solar system that has a tail like a comet.
Do we know what those tails are composed of?
It's similar. I'm not sure that they can measure from this distance that what the tail is composed of, whether it's ions of the same element or not.
Yeah.
But it has the appearance of a comet's tail, and it points away from the sun.
Fascinating. That kind of points to this other interesting aspect of the so-called rogue planets that they're starting to discover now, and they're quite numerous as well out there. They're literally flying around bodies just in space, not necessarily on a set trajectory around another sun. Of course, that's pretty interesting, and that could be one potential explanation also of what we had incoming, or what once collided with Jupiter, because you would think maybe that the sun, though, actually would be the primary attractor of this, but it could simply be that Jupiter was in a trajectory path between the incoming body and the sun at the time. I don't know what would, I guess, explain that, but Jupiter is, it's an incredibly large planet in itself. It's almost like a proto-sun. It was believed to be even a failed ignited sun, like a brown dwarf to our own sun. But what do you make of that? And if we talk a little bit more about Jupiter, because it seems to be that we have a scenario where the incoming body have been hitting Jupiter and then we have an expulsion, as you said, of Venus, and Jupiter at this point have a little pull and tug on the sun, as far as I know. That means that potentially an incoming planetary body would actually be attracted to Jupiter. But what do you make of it, Laird?
No, that's true. Jupiter, one of the functions that Jupiter serves in our solar system is, because it is so large, it tends to attract incoming objects, and actually protects the other planets in some ways because of that. But if you consider that it would appear that the generic form of a solar system is a binary system with two suns, because they see many, many, many of those out in the universe. And now imagine that in some cases, one of the two binary suns doesn't attain enough mass, doesn't acquire enough mass to attain fusion, then what you end up with is a sun-like star and a large gas giant like Jupiter. And when they go out and they look at these exoplanets, the first ones they were able to discover were the giant Jupiter-like planets. And so it's very frequent that they find a sun accompanied by a giant gas planet.
That's right. And this is, I guess, what they could see as well on the star charts is they look at one sun specifically or one star for a long time, and then they compare the maps. Actually, they take a photo at one point and then a photo at maybe a few years later, and then they see if the star has moved back or forth or to the right or left from our perspective a little bit, because that would possibly entail or mean that there is such a gas giant kind of pulling on the star, right?
That's right. Now, one argument that no one ever makes against Velikovsky, and it's sort of glaring that they never do, they never actually say that what's implied in his theory is that planets are born or can be born as a result of the impact of something on a gas giant. But no one ever makes that argument, the argument that that theory is ridiculous. And through my research, I've come to the conclusion that that may be because they don't want to raise the whole question of how planets are formed. There are right now two prevailing theories of how planets form, and it turns out that neither one of them actually holds water. There are major difficulties, theoretic difficulties, with each of the theories that come down to how planets could have as much metal in their cores as they do, or they come down to how could the planets possibly be spaced the way they are if the theory is right, and so forth. Okay, so each of these two theories has difficulties in themselves. And so as it turns out, Velikovsky's implied possibility that planets are formed when a body hits a gas giant with enough force is no less ludicrous than the two theories that the scientists are proposing.
Is one of these as well kind of connected with the Oort cloud, that we have potential mass just being kind of expelled from a few central areas here and there, and this eventually causes impacts and stuff like that, and you eventually have a planets forming as a consequence of that, or what is one of the prevailing theories there?
Yeah, that is one theory is that you have this cloud surrounding a star when it forms that eventually coalesces and forms the planets. But then there's another theory that suggests that as the sun was forming, another large body passed by and sort of drew off a bit of the sun and created these droplets that eventually coalesced into planets.
That's pretty advanced stuff.
Now, both theories, as it turns out, when you actually get down into it and look at it, neither one of them really holds water yet.
Right.
And so it's not ludicrous to think that Velikovsky's theory might be true. And then you add to that the fact that it's an established part of the theory that our moon was created when a body whacked into the Earth and knocked off a piece of it. That's the official theory. And so I don't understand how they can argue that that can happen on a small scale with the Earth, but it can't happen on a larger scale with Jupiter.
Yeah.
Okay, now the other thing that's not mentioned is that it's pretty generally accepted now that Jupiter itself is looked at as a gigantic reservoir of what is essentially primordial material that has cooled somewhat. And as you go down through the descending layers of Jupiter's atmosphere, you find all sorts of different kinds of materials being formed under different pressures. And you also find these gigantic whirling storms that are 3 times the size of the diameter of the Earth that reach all the way down to are thought to reach all the way down to the core of the planet and draw material up into the atmosphere.
So that is creating potentially the gas around the planet, right? Because if we have a storm, that would draw up material, and hence we get this big gas giant. Perimeter of Jupiter is large, but the actual solid state planet it's not that big, of course.
Right. But what it also provides us with is a mechanism by which material from the core of the planet could theoretically be brought out to the edge of the planet. Okay. Now, when they did recent studies of comets, they actually sent probes out to take samples from comets and analyze them. And what they discovered is the comets they studied were made up of what they call a real zoo of materials that the traditional theory is that these comets formed in primordial times, but the problem is that they're comprised of materials, some of which could only have formed very close to the sun, and some of which could only have formed very, very far away from the sun. And so you are presented with the problem of how do you get the material that's close to the sun out to the material that's far away from the sun and mix it together and coalesce it into a body. Now, if instead you take the posture that maybe these comets instead formed inside Jupiter, where you have this same mix of materials already there, and a mechanism to intermix them and eject them, why wouldn't the supposition be that these short period comets whose orbits typically take them close to Jupiter weren't captured by Jupiter, they originated there?
Would this, do you think, mean the most of the comets that we have on a regular path around us, originally they came out from Jupiter? Do you think so?
That's a possibility, and that possibility is enhanced a little bit by the fact that they've done calculations of the rate at which some of these comets are losing material, and they realize that they don't have a lifespan that's greater than a few thousand years. Certainly not more than tens of thousands of years. And so some event created these short period comets within historical times, or certainly within the memory of mankind.
Mm-hmm. Is this some of the things, do you think, that they learned from Deep Impact, and what was the next follow-up mission? Stardust, I think it was called.
Yes, there was a Stardust study also, that's true. And yes, those comet studies have told us a lot about the composition of the atmosphere around a comet and the composition of the comets themselves. And so now we at least have some science to go on, whereas Velikovsky was left to, with supposition to figure out what must be true.
So what else can we say about the anomalies, Laird, of our solar system at large as it is right now?
Okay, now, the truth is, what I discovered as I went through, the approach I took to Velikovsky's theory, as I said, was to not refer to any of the sources, to rely on sources he didn't have access to, with preference to sources that were very, very recent. I leaned very heavily towards articles that appeared on NASA websites, which go under an extensive review process before they're even put up on the site, and drew material out of these articles and so forth. Interestingly, that a year or so later, when my editor was going back to try to verify that the text that I quoted really existed at the link that I quoted it from, what she found was that very often the quote I had in my book had been changed on the website, or in fact that the article had been removed, sometimes not just from NASA's website, but from a dozen other websites I knew it had existed on. And so I had to put a disclaimer in the front of my book because prior to the internet, anytime an author publishes an article or a scientist publishes an article, it's fair game to quote the moment it hits press.
So why this change?
Well, there seems to be an effort to distance science from Velikovsky. You'll notice that there are frequent announcements that pertain to Venus. For example, in the last couple of years, they discovered that there's a radical called hydroxyl that was discovered in the atmosphere of Venus, and it's the first time it's ever been discovered in the atmosphere of a planet. And the official NASA announcement said that this was a radical that's sometimes found around comets. So I did some more research into that explanation and found an article that says not only is this a radical that's sometimes found around comets, it's the most common radical in a comet's atmosphere. Okay, now when you see the difference in the way that was postured by NASA as opposed to the way it was postured by this other astronomer's article, you realize that there is an active effort going on here to try to distance new finds from what would support Velikovsky.
Well, that's ridiculous. That's not scientific, is it? I mean, if they're censoring themselves just to stay away from a particular stance.
Right. Well, for example, Velikovsky had said that it would be a pivotal proof refutation of his theory when we got to Venus if we found out whether it was hot or not. Now, he's been criticized for not specifying a temperature, but since there's no quantification of what temperature Venus might have been ejected at Jupiter from, and no records on how far it might have wandered away from the sun or how close it might have wandered to the sun, or what the effect of its encounters with planets might have been on its temperature, there's not really very much a person could reasonably say, except that we would find that it's much harder than we expected.
Right. I mean, that doesn't make sense at all. And you almost have an infinite scale there too in terms of temperatures. So you could just pick a number. That's not know, critique in that sense. Why do you think then that it is that they are so vehemently staying away from Velikovsky's theories? What would that mean? Let's say that we lived in a world where his ideas and theories had been adopted, and let's say that was the prevailing theory currently now, and this is what we had learned, and this is what we're finding currently. How would that be so dangerous or such a bad thing?
Well, from my standpoint, it wouldn't be. I mean, any scientific finding potentially upturns other findings. But there are reputations at stake and there are theories at stake that the astronomic world has an awful lot invested in. And you have the added fact that Velikovsky was not an astronomer. Astronomers are not used to taking critiques from historians or from psychiatrists. And so there's an embarrassment factor here to have a total outsider come into your field and present an argument that's supported by what you consider to be nothing better than fairy tales and turn out to be right.
Yeah. Do you think there could be anything to the point of view of psychology because of the fact that this more or less demands a unstable solar system? That means large catastrophes, and although it is in our mythological record, the scientific standpoint is that, okay, yeah, it might happen, but that was millions and millions of years ago, basically. So what this would mean is that if the solar system once was unstable, nothing would prevent it from becoming that way again, correct?
That's true, and I think the bigger problem is that it really undercuts Darwinism, and Darwinism is the foundation of pretty much our entire science. Well,
that's too bad, though. In that sense, they have to, if they've laid the pieces of the puzzle out for the sake of it fitting together, but they don't have the correct pieces to begin with, then that's not a good way. But isn't there a way they can just keep Darwin evolution and still just adopt a different cosmology, though?
Well, I would think that there would be, but from the time that Velikovsky first published, the astronomic world got their hackles up, and they took very public stands against him, flatly declared his theory to be nonsense, and have done so many times, and done so through the voices of so many authoritative figures in the astronomic world, that to try to back away from it right now is going to make an entire academic field look ridiculous. Now, when we actually got to Venus and discovered that it was hot, the announcement that it was hot was accompanied by never proposed theory before that the reason that it was hot was because of a runaway greenhouse effect.
Ah, convenient.
Now, Carl Sagan had argued that when we got to Venus, we were going to find that it was covered with craters and that would be a definitive proof against Velikovsky. When we actually got to Venus, we found out that there were far fewer craters than there should be if it was as old as people say it is. And so when they announced the relatively pristine surface of Venus, it was accompanied with a theory, if you can call it a theory, that proposes that Venus must have been recently globally resurfaced by unknown geological forces.
Do they say, for instance, then that, okay, we have the geology on Venus is so tough and so hard in that sense that we have a lot of lava spewing out, and hence we see a very untouched surface in a way?
No, because the original theory from the astronomic world, if it's an old planet, it can't still be volcanically active, or it shouldn't be. Mm-hmm. But in fact, the recent probes to Venus have suggested that it is still volcanically active. Okay, now there's another problem on Venus, and that is that they've confirmed the existence of basalt on the surface of Venus, which is a rock. It's a volcanic rock that forms over the course of 1,000 years or so. But they haven't been able to confirm the existence of granite, which takes millions of years to form.
Interesting.
So recently, a few years back, there was an announcement that through infrared studies, they were able to confirm the existence of granite in the highlands of Venus. And a number of scientists came out and said, well, that's interesting because that's the first time anybody's ever been able to use that technique to confirm the existence of granite. But the announcement, even when the announcement itself was made, there was another researcher from the same group, although not on the same team, who also issued a statement saying that the facts didn't support that and that the team itself didn't really believe it.
Interesting. How hot is Venus? Can a probe land there? We had this parachute probe going down there allegedly. When was this again? Back in the early 80s, 70s maybe even.
70s. I think in the 70s, there were a couple of Venusian probes that went there.
That's right.
Venus is hot enough to melt lead at the surface.
Wow.
So that's pretty hot. It's hotter than anyone expected.
So we build a probe in gold, so we could exclude going there on that way.
Yes. Okay. So now, one of the things that concerns me is the concept of coincidence. We have, at every stage of Velikovsky's theory, at every critical stage of the theory, at the point where Venus is ejected from Jupiter, and at the point where there's an impact with Mars, and at the point where it supposedly made close encounters with the Earth, and at the point where Mars supposedly made close encounters with the Earth, and even to Venus settling down into its orbit, or our probes that actually reached Venus and could prove what was true about Venus. At every stage along the process, you have a growing list of issues for which scientists have offered alternate explanations. But my problem is that these lists of issues in every case could be resolved with one cause if Velikovsky's right. And if he's wrong, you've got this impressive list of coincidences that somehow turned out to be true despite the fact that he's wrong. Now, to my way of thinking, that's not the hallmark of a theory that's wrong.
That's right.
And somehow the traditional scientists have a tolerance for compounding coincidences again and again and again and again and again.
Except
if it's used, to support a theory that they agree with.
That's right, or disagree with that they throw this out because of the basis. It's a very, very strange attitude, and even Carl Sagan, of course, was instrumental in helping to putting down the message that Velikovsky came with. And I want to continue to talk more with you about this after the break, Laird. We have so much more to discuss here, of course. But in the meantime, let's talk a little bit about how people can get a copy of the book, The Velikovsky Heresies. The full title is Worlds in Collision, an Ancient Catastrophes Revisited. Do you have a personal website yet, Laird?
No, I don't have a personal website. The best place you can get the Velikovsky Heresies at any of the traditional websites. You can find it in bookstores. I believe it's on the shelves in Barnes & Noble, but if not, it can be ordered there. It can be ordered through my publisher's website, innertraditions.com. It's available in a Kindle format or in a printed format. It's pretty available. It's not expensive. Google it and you'll find it. I think last time I looked, there were probably 10,000 web hits on the book.
Wow, there you go. Amazing.
Event in Egypt, it would have been an event that would have been registered in other parts of the world. And so he started looking for texts from other cultures that might have a similar report from a similar time period.
See, that's interesting because it seems then that we've gone through a period where biblical history was for a while there kind of taken as this is what happened in history. This is just the way it is. Then we have the emergence of the scientific field, and these theories and ideas slowly are kind of pushed to the side, and then they begin to re-emerge again with both with Velikovsky, of course, but also, before that, his friend then Sigmund Freud also did his own studies on comparative mythology, if you will, between character like Moses and Akhenaten as well. So that whole gang, if you will, then from that time, were looking into the Bible as being something real, story-wise, that actually took place and actually happened around Egypt and Middle East at the time.
Right, or at least that some of the events reported in the Bible had basis in fact. The Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten and stories about Oedipus, and wanted to write a psychological, historical book on that subject. And so he was spending a lot of time in the Columbia University Library researching for that. And during the process of that research, he stumbled across some references in Egypt to a time of great upheaval. And the sorts of events they were describing included things like rivers running red and major earthquakes and major volcanic eruptions and unusual things happening with the animal world and so forth. And he made a connection to the descriptions in the book of Exodus of events that happened at the time Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. And so he wondered whether there might be a historical basis for those biblical accounts, and he realized, based on the scope of the upheaval, that this would not have been a localized theory and some of the basic tenets of his theory. Okay, Velikovsky was trained as a doctor and then as a psychiatrist, and started out in Berlin. He was a Jew, and he published an academic journal in Berlin that was very well received and that was edited partially by Albert Einstein. And then he and Einstein were both known for their involvement in establishing the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And so also Velikovsky had been trained by one of the most famous students of Sigmund Freud, a gentleman by the name of Wilhelm Steckler. And so Velikovsky was a person who had a presence on the international scene before he ever wrote a book. But shortly before 1950, he brought his family to New York City, intending to research a historical book that he eventually published called Oedipus and Akhenaten. He had noticed parallels between stories about I think the academic link between the two subjects is found in the subject of comparative cosmology. Velikovsky used references from various cultures, ancient texts, and so forth, the same kinds of references I would use for my Dogen studies to justify his theories. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, Salem and Portland, Oregon, and in the 1970s, that was the hotbed of support for Velikovsky's theories. And so at that time, you could hardly walk down a city street without seeing a copy of a magazine available for free discussing Velikovsky's theories. And then over the years, I had paid attention to the controversy and became more and more interested when I realized that after a very long period of time, it hadn't become resolved. And so I started asking myself if it might not be possible to find a single fact that would demonstrate in some unequivocal way that Velikovsky either could not be right or that he must be right.
We just wanted to mention, by the way, Laird, if there is such a thing as a Red Eyes guest headquarters, it's got to be Portland. There are so many Oregonians on this program. It's crazy.
Yes, well, Oregonians have always thought outside the box.
Well, there you go. It's got to be that.
I had an education in Salem, Oregon that was a very unusual approach to education that actively encouraged my classmates and I to think outside the box.
Well, there you go. I didn't mean to cut you off there, so please go ahead. And I want to get into it a little bit later here as well, in terms of Velikovsky's work himself, where he... because he certainly have spearheaded this, and so many other people have picked up on his work, either, maybe gotten a slightly different theory, elaborated on it, or further just trying to find evidence for his theories. But how much do you know about his background, where he got some of the data and information from, Laird?
Okay, let's start and give you a little bit of background on who Velikovsky was and how he came to his